E ele volta então para a Europa, se instalando em Lausanne, Suíça, e com o seguinte lema: eu vou islamizar o Ocidente. Quando nós hoje avaliamos a influência que o Schwann teve sobre figuras de primeiríssimo plano da intelectualidade, da política e das finanças europeias, você vê que a islamização do Ocidente começou muito por cima. Né? Quando eu tive eu tive contato com a Tariqa por uns dois anos, naquela época eu vi que estava começando um certo intercâmbio entre o Martin Lynx, ou Sheikh Abu Bakr Sirajeddin, que era o segundo no comando da Tariqa do Schwann, e o Príncipe Charles. Sobretudo a partir de um livro maravilhoso que o Lynx escreveu, The Secret of Shakespeare. Primeira edição chamada Shakespeare in the Light of Tradition, depois The Secret of Shakespeare. Provavelmente o melhor livro que alguém já escreveu sobre Shakespeare, mostrando todo o conteúdo esotérico e simbólico das peças de Shakespeare. E quando veio uma segunda edição, esse livro veio com um prefácio do Príncipe Charles. Eu falei, opa, peraí. Quer dizer que eles estão trocando figurinha, de algum modo. Mas isso foi 30 anos atrás. É isso. Ao longo do tempo, o Príncipe Charles vai assumindo cada vez mais uma defesa aberta do Islã, se torna o grande protetor do Islã. Fala, claro que isso foi influência do Martin Lynx. Porém, se você fala em influência, agora, um sheik sufi não fica procurando influência sobre os outros. Ou o sujeito vira discípulo dele, ou nada. Quer dizer, quem não é discípulo simplesmente não tem acesso a essas coisas. Então, para mim, se tornou claro que o Príncipe Charles havia se tornado um membro da Tariqa, tá certo? O que significa que ele não tinha aderido ao Islã exotérico. Isso é muito importante, né? Mas ao Islã esotérico. E nesses dias, trocando umas figurinhas com o grande historiador esotérico maçônico Angel Miller, eu recebi uns artigos que confirmavam isso. Quer dizer que o Príncipe Charles havia aderido ao Islã na versão do Guénon, já tinha se tornado uma coisa conhecida e banal na Inglaterra. Todo mundo sabe disso, não há mais dúvida. Né? Quer dizer, não é questão de discutir, não, ele virou muçulmano, não virou muçulmano. Falo, não, eu estou falando do nível esotérico, onde as coisas simplesmente não se colocam assim. Não quer dizer que ele se converteu ao islamismo. Mesmo que entre numa tarica, não quer dizer que você se converteu ao islamismo. Isso aí tem páginas e páginas do Guénon e Schwann mostrando que na esfera esotérica não existe isso de conversão. A conversão é um elemento próprio do exoterismo. Né? E então pouco interessa se converter ou não, o fato é que ele é o membro da Tariqa e o membro da Tariqa faz o que o Sheik manda.
Agora, aqui eu estou falando há anos, eu estou dizendo o seguinte: o Príncipe Charles da Inglaterra é um agente islâmico, ele trabalha para o Islã. Digo para você, ele é membro de uma Tariqa, Organização Esotérica Islâmica. Eu sei porque eu conheci o Sheik, conheci o guru dele, né? Sou Martin Lynx, que tinha o nome islâmico de, Sheikh Abu Bakr Sirajeddin. Né? Não nego que o Martin Lynx fosse um grande homem, um grande escritor, um grande cabeça, mas era um agente islâmico, obviamente. Né? Então, outro membro da mesma Tariqa, que é o filósofo Seyyed Hossein Nasr, não nego que seja um gênio, intelectualmente tenho o maior respeito por ele, mas todo esse lado oculto da política internacional, essas manobras ocultas, não merecem o meu respeito de maneira alguma, porque eu sigo aquilo que o Cristo disse. Tudo tem que ser falado em público, na lata, e nada de oculto. Com o negócio que é oculto já não presta. Tá? Tanto que no meio tem a sílaba cu. Né? Então, o que é oculto está no cu. Né? Então, coisa boa não é. Né? Ó, do cu, assim, não é bom nem o que sai e muito menos o que entra. Cuidado com isso, minha gente. Né? Então, naquela, os filósofos, se você nasce 20 anos atrás, escreveu um livro que se chama The Encounter of Man and Nature, publicado, aliás, no Brasil, numa tradução meio capenga, pela editora Zahar, com o título Homem e a Natureza. Eu, quando li esse livro, fiquei impressionadíssimo, porque ele partia da existência de um negócio chamado crise ecológica, que até hoje não sei se existe e acho que não existe. Tá certo? e dizia que a culpa da crise ecológica era da perda da espiritualidade no Ocidente, porque no mundo medieval, né, o pessoal tinha uma visão espiritual da natureza. Quando se perdeu isso, tudo ficou mecanizado, a natureza virou apenas matéria-prima para a indústria, e daí fudeu. O argumento era até bonito, né? Só que, depois eu vi que o argumento está parcialmente certo no que diz respeito ao Ocidente. Quer dizer, essa perda da espiritualidade na natureza, de fato, causa um desrespeito geral para a natureza, sem sombra de dúvida. Tá certo? Porém, quem eram os islâmicos para falar disso? Né? Porque no mundo inteiro, o lugar onde existe mais equilíbrio entre o homem e a natureza é o Ocidente. Vocês viajem pela Europa Ocidental, vejam as cidadezinhas do interior da França, do interior da Alemanha, do interior da Inglaterra, falam, maior integração, maior equilíbrio entre homem e natureza não é possível. Agora, vocês vão ver o que se passa na China, o que se passa na Índia, o que se passa na Rússia, o que se passa nos países islâmicos, é um desastre ecológico total. O desastre ecológico está lá, não está aqui, porra. Né? Então, embora a tese do Seyyed Hossein Nasr estivesse certa em si, ele estava se prevalecendo de uma verdade para passar uma mentira. A verdade é, a crise ecológica tem algo, na medida em que ela existe, ela tem algo a ver com a perda da espiritualidade da natureza. Muito bem, seu Nasr, está certo? Só que ele se prevalecia disso para fingir que o Islã, né, tinha autoridade para passar pito no Ocidente sobre esse aspecto, coisa que não tinha de maneira alguma. Né? Então, passados 20 anos da publicação desse livro, que notem bem, é de um indivíduo que era membro da Tariqa, chefiado pelo Sr. Martin, né, que na época era chefiado pelo Fritjof Lund. Passado esse tempo todo, o príncipe Charles, tá certo, que já deu bandeira de ser o maior protetor da invasão islâmica, e que eu sei que é um membro da Tariqa, sei porque eu sou testemunha, tá certo? Eu vi a coisa começar, tá certo? E, aliás, não era só o príncipe Charles, tinha muita gente importante nessa Tariqa. O Aga Khan, o homem mais rico do Oriente, era membro da Tariqa. Ele chegava lá, o sheik passava num pito, daquela boca burra, o sujeito, sim, né? Porque discípulo obedece o sheik, né? Então aparece o príncipe Charles dizendo: para salvar o mundo temos de seguir o caminho islâmico. Ou seja, repetindo a tese do Seyyed Hossein Nasr. 30 anos depois, quando já se provou que ela está furada. Então, o cara está dando bandeira de que ele é pró-islâmico. Por quê? Para ser membro da Tariqa, bom, nessa Tariqa deles, eles não tinham só grupos muçulmanos, tinha grupos católicos, ortodoxos, protestantes, budistas, né? E no meio o Fritjof Lund posando como se fosse um papa interreligioso, papa de todas as religiões. Né? Então, fosse qual fosse a religião originária do sujeito, ele estava trabalhando para o projeto islâmico. Qual é o projeto islâmico? O projeto que o Suon anunciou ao voltar da Argélia nos anos 50, dizendo: vou islamizar a Europa. Né? E o sujeito, com esse propósito, e chefiando, tendo poder sobre centenas de intelectuais, políticos, banqueiros, bilionários, etc. É claro que o sujeito está fazendo isso. Ele foi o grande responsável, foi o sujeito que arrombou a porta da Europa para a invasão islâmica que veio depois. Os analistas políticos comuns não sabem essas coisas porque não estudam. Tá certo? Então está aí, eu estou dizendo, faz anos que o príncipe Charles, né, é agente islâmico.
Olha, a família real como um todo eu não sei, tá certo? Mas o príncipe Charles, eu tenho certeza absoluta que ele é um servidor do Islã. Tá certo? Eu sei isso aí, vamos dizer, por certo modo, por informação direta, quer dizer, ele foi discípulo de um sheik islâmico durante muito tempo, e a relação discípulo e mestre no esoterismo islâmico é relação de obediência total, não importa se o cara é príncipe, multibilionário, general, não interessa, tá certo? Então ele foi discípulo desse sheik por mais de 20 anos, e a gente vê pelas atitudes públicas dele, são atitudes de franca proteção ao Islã. Está na cara que o governo americano, isso é o establishment, ou aquilo que o Nicholas Seger chama corporação, está trabalhando para a ascensão islâmica mundial. Assim como a Casa Real Britânica, que é um elemento fundamental da corporação, está protegendo a invasão islâmica a olhos vistos. Eu digo para vocês, o príncipe Charles é membro de uma tariqa, ele obedece um sheik islâmico. Meu Deus do céu.
Ai. E também aqui o Bruno Gama Duarte me mandou um negócio interessantíssimo que eu não tinha visto. É um material de 2006 é uma conferência sobre estudos tradicionais, né? Comparative Religion, religião comparada e tal, onde os conferencistas principais eram Seyyed Hossein Nasr, Houston Smith e outros, todos membros da Tariqa do Free of Shlomo, todos discípulos do Shlomo. E quem faz a conferência inaugural? O Príncipe Charles. Ou seja, ele não está lá só abrilhantando com a sua presença real, tá certo? Um empreendimento que é, obviamente, parte de um gigantesco plano de ocupação do Ocidente pelo Islã. Eu já expliquei isso, posso voltar a explicar. Quando você lê a apresentação que ele faz, você vê que ele entende profundamente de todo o pensamento da escola dita tradicionalista. Guénon, Shlomo, Burckhardt, ele leu tudo, tanto quanto eu, entende profundamente do negócio e está totalmente imbuído. Eu entendo um pouquinho mais do que ele, porque além de estudar o negócio e perceber as perspectivas imensas e profundas que isso abre para a compreensão da formação das civilizações e para a compreensão do próprio destino humano sobre a Terra e das relações entre homem e Deus, que sem dúvida é um material de uma riqueza extraordinária, além de ter percebido tudo isso, eu percebi também que havia de todo esse quadro, alguns pontos obscuros premeditadamente colocados lá para que você não perceba. E esse eu não percebi, o Príncipe Charles não percebeu até hoje. Ele está lá, vamos dizer, com toda a sinceridade, com toda a boa vontade, né, fazendo uma coisa que no fundo é admirável, porque você vê um príncipe herdeiro, né, representando a casa real britânica, que se dá um trabalho de estudar tudo isto, que é vamos dizer, uma das bibliografias mais difíceis e trabalhosas do universo, e chegar ao nível de compreensão que ele chegou desse material, eu acho que o que ele diz ali está no nível de qualquer pessoa, né, qualquer dos teóricos e porta-vozes dessa escola, que não é bem uma escola, na verdade não é uma escola, são duas, não são linhas diferentes. Mas ele absorveu tudo. Isso já é uma coisa maravilhosa. Agora ele precisaria um pouquinho além e perceber qual é o sentido estratégico disso dentro do plano maior das guerras de civilizações. Isso aí ele não percebeu. Aliás, ele está achando que esse aporte da escola tradicionalista pode renovar ali a cultura britânica, pode devolver a sanidade à Europa. Tá certo? Não pode, não. Porque ali esse pessoal sufre, eles vão fazer a coisa ambígua. Tá certo? Eles vão tentar adoecer a Europa até a Europa ficar bem fraquinha. E quando a Europa cai na mão deles, islamiza tudo, daí eles curam. Eles mandam a doença e mandam a cura. Tá certo? Isso é o velho truque sufi, que aliás vem da própria concepção islâmica de Deus. Porque nós aqui achamos, vamos dizer, que os malefícios vêm do diabo. E os bens vêm de Deus. E eles acham não, que o bem e o mal vêm tudo de Deus. Então, isso quer dizer, se é para fazer a sacanagem, eles seguem muito a teoria do bode. Sabe aquele negócio? Pô, o bode dentro de casa, aí botou uma merda, aí tira o bode, agora ficou bom, ficou bom. Né? Então, quando dá zero, para ele está ótimo, é vantagem. Então, eu tinha dito há anos atrás, olha, o Príncipe Charles é um membro da Tariqa do Shlomo, um discípulo do Martin Lings. Eu sei porque eu conheci o Martin Lings. Né? Tive muito boas relações com o Martin Lings, até quando perdi o contato com ele por fatores que não interessa, que não foi por culpa dele, foi um problema com o Shlomo, mas que não compromete o Lings de maneira alguma, nem o Lings, nem o Seyyed Hossein Nasr, são pessoas que eu tenho uma hora respeito. Ele sempre foi discípulo do Martin Lings, o qual foi sucessor do Shuon como sheikh de uma tariqa. Tariqa é uma organização esotérica islâmica. Hein? Então, um item importante, vamos dizer, na guerra cultural do Islã com o Ocidente é que a religião muçulmana reconhece a importância, a santidade do nosso Senhor Jesus Cristo, não o aceita como Deus. Mas a doutrina é um pouco contraditória, porque por um lado ela diz que Jesus Cristo é o verbo de Deus, Kalimatullah, quer dizer, Logos de Deus, né? E por outro lado diz que ele não é Deus. Fala, bom, mas como é que o Logos, a inteligência de Deus, pode não ser Deus? Eu acho que a doutrina islâmica é contraditória nesse ponto. Mas também isso é difícil de discutir, por quê? Porque não existe uma doutrina islâmica uniforme, existe um monte de escolas, e todas elas são consideradas legítimas. Um diz uma coisa, outro diz outra. Né? Mas, de modo geral, Jesus é qualificado ali como um profeta, entre aspas. No nível mais esotérico, mais profundo, né, existe uma diferença islâmica, que é a diferença entre Sharia, que é a lei que é para todo mundo, a religião exotérica, tá certo? E Hakikat, que é verdade, ou Tarika, que é caminho, que é para uma elite espiritual mais qualificada. E a teoria que o René Guénon espalhou no Ocidente é que o cristianismo era originariamente apenas uma tárika, não era uma religião, não tinha autoridade de religião, era apenas uma escola de ensinamentos secretos. E que, em função da necessidade do mundo antigo que estava caindo pelas tabelas, esse esoterismo se exoterizou e virou uma religião ex post facto. Né? O último livro do Jean Borella, que se chama Esoterismo Guénoniano e Mistério Cristão, demonstra que essa tese é absolutamente impossível, inviável, historicamente, absolutamente falsa. Ora, isso quer dizer o seguinte, que a ideia não é destruir o cristianismo, mas absorvê-lo dentro do Islã como uma variante esotérica do Islã. Porque as escolas esotéricas elas estão submetidas à religião majoritária ou exotérica. Então você islamiza tudo, mas os elementos, vamos dizer, aproveitáveis do cristianismo se integrariam dentro do Islã como sendo uma tarica entre outros. E os cristãozinhos ficam lá tudo contentes porque eles ainda são cristãos. Olha, minha gente, eu caí nessa história. O João disse para mim, olha, você pode praticar esoterismo islâmico sem você deixar de ser cristão. Foi depois que eu percebi, falaram, não. O cristianismo que eles estão falando é apenas um esoterismo dentro da religião islâmica. Do mesmo modo que, na escatologia islâmica, a versão islâmica do Apocalipse, virá um enviado islâmico, que é o Mahdi, quer dizer, o esperado, esse que vai salvar o mundo, e Jesus Cristo virá para ajudá-lo. Jesus Cristo vai ser uma ordenança do Mahdi. Então, é esta a boa convivência, que essa turma das taricas quer com o cristianismo. Então, quando eu percebi que isso aí era, no fundo, é uma empulhação, você está convencendo o cara que ele vai continuar sendo cristão, você está integrando esse cristianismo dele como uma parte subordinada dentro da moral, falou, esta aqui, a estratégia inteira da escola de Guénon como é essa. Falamos da unidade transcendente das religiões, né? O João se considera uma espécie de papa de todas as religiões, né? E daí nós reequacionamos, nós redistribuímos as várias religiões, todas elas sob a égide do Islã. Isso aí o príncipe Charles ainda não percebeu. Então, você vê que nas últimas, recentemente, sheiks islâmicos importantes estão recomendando aos muçulmanos na Inglaterra que votem no Partido Conservador. Então nós fazemos uma aliança com o Partido Conservador e nós governamos a Inglaterra. E dentro do Partido Conservador vai ter um monte de idiota cristão que acha que os caras estão lá mesmo para ajudar. Não, eles vão te ajudar, mas desde que você se integre no esquema deles. Quer dizer, o cristianismo aí perde o estatuto de religião, deixa de ser uma religião de pleno direito e se torna o quê? Um esoterismo dentro do exoterismo islâmico. E é por isso mesmo que o Guénon defendia aquela teoria de que o cristianismo, na origem, era apenas uma escola esotérica, que depois virou uma religião de massas. Quando isso aí é totalmente desmentido pela letra do Evangelho, por todos os testemunhos da época, o cristianismo nunca foi esotérico, tá certo? Ele já se abriu para todos desde o início. O Cristo já veio dizendo, eu vim trazer a salvação para o judeu e o gentio por igual, você está entendendo? E já começou a batizar gente para tudo quanto é lado, está entendendo? Tem o famoso episódio, eu não me lembro em que livro está, em que São Pedro encontra um centurião, e ele está ali conversando com o centurião, fazendo a pregação para o centurião, e a massa que está ouvindo, massa romana, né, se converte instantaneamente. Vem o Espírito Santo e converte a massa inteira. Quer dizer, como é que foi vamos dizer, um esoterismo, quer dizer, uma sociedade quase secreta, que depois gradativamente foi se exoterizando até chegar no Concílio de Nicéia, onde, diz o Guénon, foi só aí que o cristianismo se constituiu como religião, antes era só esoterismo. Isso é mentira! Mentira! O Guénon sabia que isso era furado, pô. Quer dizer, eu não estou negando o valor imenso da obra do Guénon, inclusive do ponto de vista da mecânica, do processo civilizacional. Essa gente da Tariqa do Som tem uma compreensão tão profunda que nenhum cientista político ou historiador ocidental tem. E é bom que o príncipe Charles saiba isso, que ele está começando a compreender o mecanismo, como é que se gera e se destrói as civilizações. Só que é o seguinte, a parte importante ainda não contaram para ele. Esconderam o segredo. Como é que uma civilização engole a outra dizendo que está defendendo. Tá certo? Então, agradeço muito ao Bruno Gama Duarte, que tem me mandado isso. Ainda vou escrever artigo sobre isso, vou dar as fontes tudo direitinho. Né? Foi uma conferência de 2006. Vendo a lista dos participantes, né? Então a gente já sabe, isso aqui é coisa da Tariqa do Som, porque são todos membros. Né? Então aparece lá um dizendo que é budista, outro dizendo que é hinduísta, outro dizendo que é protestante, e quando você vai ver, são todos membros da Tariqa. Eu já vi isso acontecer, vi isso com os meus 2 olhos. Olhos, ouvidos, eu estava lá, eu vi. Então aquele negócio, meninos, eu vi. Não veio lá, qual é a fonte? A fonte, isso é Moá, meu filho. Eu sou testemunha ocular da história, tá vendo? Eu vi tudo isso acontecendo. E eu não sei, vamos dizer, até que ponto o príncipe Charles está entendendo exatamente aonde que ele está entrando. Eu sei que hoje em dia existem esses 3 grandes esquemas globalistas. Tem o esquema, vamos chamar de ocidental, que é Jorge Soros, Rockefeller, essa turma do CFS. Tem o esquema islâmico e tem o bom e velho esquema comunista. E eles, às vezes, concorrem, às vezes se combatem uns aos outros. Tá, mas está todo mundo, o objetivo todo é dominar o mundo. Quer dizer, quanta gente tem que se acha capacitada para governar o mundo? Ai, meu saco! Né? E depois vem com umas teorias extravagantes fazendo isso. Tem até cara que defende isso aí, defende a perspectiva evolucionista, diz que as espécies, né, elas proliferam quando elas dão certo. Então é a sobrevivência do mais apto. O mais apto prolifera mais. Mas se é assim, meu filho, as pessoas mais aptas estão na África, na Ásia, no terceiro mundo, que é onde mais procria. Né? Ao passo que na Europa, nos Estados Unidos, ninguém quer procriar. Então, ao longo dos últimos séculos, você vê que a população cresceu onde? Cresceu nas regiões mais pobres e miseráveis, não tem o que comer. Então, isso é que é a sobrevivência do mais apto? Né? E assim vai.
Ladies and gentlemen, it is a great sadness that I cannot be with you to participate in and benefit from this conference on Islam and Muslims in the world today. However, I particularly wanted to take this opportunity to say a few words to preface the vitally important topics which you will be discussing over the next 2 days. I also wanted to express appreciation to the Prime Minister for making time before he steps down to organize this exchange of views by so senior and experienced a group of speakers. For more than 20 years now, I've been fascinated by the relationships between the Abrahamic faiths of Islam, Christianity and Judaism. And this fascination stems partly from the particular interest I have in the ethnic, religious and cultural diversity which makes up modern Britain. For me, this unity through diversity can represent a great richness and a great strength for our society. But my fascination has been leavened with a concern that while there is much which binds the children of Abraham together, there is also much which prevents us from coming closer. This concern has been steadily growing, and as long ago as 1993, some of you may recall that as its patron I gave a speech at the Oxford Centre for Islamic Studies in which I said, I believe wholeheartedly that the links between these two worlds matter more today than ever before, because the degree of misunderstanding between the Islamic and Western worlds remains dangerously high, and because the need for the two to live and work together in our increasingly interdependent world has never been greater. Well, ladies and gentlemen, I have rarely hoped more fervently to be proved wrong. Sadly, events have shown that there was at least some truth in my analysis. Despite advancing these thoughts nearly 15 years ago, however, I have never subscribed to the view that a so-called clash of civilizations is somehow inevitable. Indeed, I believe that by redoubling our efforts to promote tolerance and understanding, people at all levels of society can make all the difference. This, of course, is very easy to say, but I have a feeling that the doing may also be within our grasp. In fact, while many commentators have expressed reservations about the resurgence of spirituality around the world, I find this a profoundly heartening sign. I cannot claim to be qualified to interpret the sacred texts of any of the great faiths, that is, for those called and properly trained to be spiritual leaders. But I do think that there is great wisdom in the Arab proverb which says, what comes from the lips reaches the ears, what comes from the heart reaches the heart. So when my heart tells me to work towards greater tolerance and understanding, my head tells me that to translate this into action, we could do worse than begin by reassessing, calmly and rationally, our perceptions of one another. There is so much ill-informed and reactionary commentary that it is hugely difficult for the man or woman, or indeed the young person in the street, to know where the truth really lies. Western perceptions of Islam and Muslim perceptions of other faiths seem to me rather like the two ends of a balance. What affects one immediately and unavoidably affects the other. Ladies and gentlemen, I believe that resolving imbalance through balanced thoughts and balanced actions is an essential first step, and one which each and every one of us can take. Now, I'm not trying to say that we are all the same. We are not. But when we think about it, we do share common values, and I have no doubt that this conference will enhance and enrich our understanding of them. As the Christian tradition teaches us, let brotherly love continue. Be not forgetful to entertain strangers, for thereby some have entertained angels unawares. This text, which means so much to Christians, is based upon an episode in the life of Abraham, whose example is cherished also by Jews and Muslims. Our common values celebrate humility, greatness of soul, honor, magnanimity, and indeed hospitality. It is these values which define our worth and status as human beings, and which, when held in proper balance, manifest the harmony between mankind and the temporal order in which we live. Promoting greater understanding of our shared values, in plain and simple terms, seems to me another area where we could all make a valuable personal contribution. A third area in which I believe we all have a role to play is in educating those who confuse extremism and the norm. Extremism is, by definition, the exception. It is not the standard by which any informed judgment can be made. Tragically, extremism exists within every faith, within every culture and tradition, and none is immune from the devastating consequences which result from its confusion with the normal thoughts, words, and deeds of the overwhelming majority. But to confuse extremism with the norm is to ignore, in some cases perhaps deliberately, our common values. It is to be part of the problem, not part of the solution. By working together, we can move mountains. By working in opposition to each other, we simply create bigger mountains and cancel each other out, and worse. In all of this, I am struck by the great challenges which we must all face together. Perhaps the greatest of all is climate change, where common actions in each and every country are urgently required to protect the common inheritance that has been given to us by the Creator, by our Sustainer. And when we consider the sacred texts of Islam, Christianity, and Judaism, we find common themes of stewardship and justice towards the environment. If only the great Abrahamic faiths could work together from their sacred texts to stand on common ground and work towards the protection of our planet. Ladies and gentlemen, I do hope that the great minds and the wealth of practical experience gathered together in this room will be able to move the debate forward. By getting to know each other better, by listening at least as much as we talk, and by translating talk into action, I trust and pray that we might be able to advance just a few steps further along the road towards tolerance and understanding. Ladies and gentlemen, in these uprooted times, there is a great need for constancy, a need for those who can rise above the clamour, the din, and the sheer pace of our lives to help us to rediscover those truths that are immutable and eternal. A need for those who can speak of that eternal wisdom which is called the perennial philosophy. Looking at the program for this conference being organized by Sacred Web on the theme of tradition in the modern world and the list of speakers, I know that you will be hearing just this kind of teaching from just these kinds of people. Within the overall theme, there would seem to be a marvelous diversity of matters being discussed, matters related to religion, the arts, the economy, the environment, and much else. Although, very sadly, I cannot be with you, I do just want to say that I am always delighted to receive the latest issue of Sacred Web, because so often I come across such deeply revealing and enlightening articles, rich in content and diverse in subject matter. In addition, through the work of the Temenos Academy, of which I am patron, I have been fortunate to enjoy the writings of some of your colleagues, people such as Professor Syed Hossein Nasr, and of course the late Dr. Martin Lings, whose presence amongst us is so profoundly missed. The Temenos Academy has been and remains closely associated with many of those who have written and continue to write for Sacred Web, and indeed for Sophia and other related journals. From the beginning, with the launch of the original Temenos Review, the Temenos Academy has not only been devoted to what its founders have referred to as the arts of the imagination, but has also been committed both to the perennial philosophy and to the notion that man is at root a spiritual creature with spiritual and intellectual needs which have to be nourished if we are to fulfill our potential. Both of these matters are at the heart of the teachings of Sacred Web. Temenos Academy and Sacred Web are also, of course, dedicated to an exploration of the role of tradition in the modern world, the subject of this conference, and indeed to a critique of the false premises of modernity, a critique set out in one of the seminal texts of the traditionalists, René Guénon's The Reign of Quantity. Now, many find this teaching difficult, not least because it asks us to question our very mode of being, and perhaps because it asks us to question an ideology in the form of modernism that has become so set in our minds that any other way of being seems in some sense fanciful and unrealistic. However, the teachings of the traditionalists should not, in any sense, be taken to mean that they seek, as it were, to repeat the past, or indeed simply to draw a distinction between the present and the past. Theirs is not a nostalgia for the past, but a yearning for the sacred, and if they defend the past, it is because in the pre-modern world all civilizations were marked by the presence of the sacred. As I understand it, in referring to tradition, they refer to a metaphysical reality and to underlying principles that are timeless, as true now as they have ever been and will be. And by way of contrast, in referring to modernism, they refer to a particular, though false, definition of reality, a particular, though false, manner of seeing and engaging with the world that likewise is distinguished not by time, but by its ideology. In an article written in 1983 for the traditionalist journal Studies in Comparative Religion, Professor Nasr put it this way: when we use the term modern, we mean neither contemporary nor up-to-date. Rather, for us, modern means that which is cut off from the transcendent, from the immutable principles which in reality govern all things, and which are made known to man through revelation in its most universal sense. Modernism is thus contrasted with tradition. The latter implies all that which is of divine origin, along with its manifestations and deployments on the human plane, while the former, by contrast, implies all that is merely human and now ever more increasingly subhuman, and all that is divorced and cut off from the divine source. Most especially, therefore, we can see that it is the very timeless quality of these immutable principles of tradition that makes its teaching so timely. For me, the teachings of tradition suggest the presence of a reality that can bring about a reality of integration. And it is this reality that can be contrasted with so much of modernism's obsession with disintegration, disconnection, and deconstruction, that which is sometimes termed the malaise of modernity. Cut off at the root from the transcendent, modernism has become deracinated and has separated itself, and thereby everything that comes within its thrall, from that which integrates, that which enables us to turn towards and reconnect with the divine. In this way, the loss of tradition cuts to the very core of our being, since it conditions that which we can know and be. For modernism, by its unrelenting emphasis on the quantitative view of reality, limits and distorts the true nature of the real and our perception of it. Whilst it has enabled us to know much that has been of huge material benefit, it also prevents us from knowing that which I would like to refer to as the knowledge of the heart, that which enables us to be fully human. This dilemma is captured in ancient notions of balance and harmony, notions that are, for example, expressed in many guises in that wonderful Kabbalistic diagram of the Tree of Life. As the Temenos fellow Warren Kenton so beautifully explains in his lectures to the students of the Academy, the teaching of the Tree of Life is that the active and the passive aspects of life, which on their own may lead to imbalance and disharmony, can only be brought together in harmony by the influx into our lives of the divine and the sacred. Whether or not we interpret this image as an explanation of an outer or inner orientation, it is in this way, and only in this way, that the forces or characteristics of expansion and constraint can be brought into balance. But, of course, in both the inner and outer dimensions of our lives, many of us at present experience the very imbalance and disharmony that this mystical framework, and indeed the teachings of mystics of all times, show to be harmful, or, to use a contemporary term, unsustainable. And this leads me to a final and somewhat troubling matter that lies at the heart of tradition and its critique of modernism. None of us, I imagine, can fail to be conscious of and be concerned about those matters that might together be called the environmental crisis of the 21st century. Indeed, none other than Sir Martin Rees, the Astronomer Royal and President of the Royal Society, in his book Our Final Century, has said that in the 21st century, humanity is more at risk than ever before from the misapplication of science, and the environmental pressures induced by collective human actions could trigger catastrophes more threatening than any natural hazards. Now, for many years, what it's been worth, I've been trying, often in the face of relentless criticism and ridicule, to draw attention to some of the elements of this crisis and to the ways in which they are linked to conventional values. At times, when in optimistic mood, I am encouraged to believe that we can come to our senses in time and change our ways of being before we are obliged to do so by catastrophic circumstances. But I'm afraid that I do not always take this view. Often I find myself convinced of the warnings given not only by Sir Martin Rees, but also, of course, by sages and mystics of all faiths and of all time. Warnings of the coming of a dark age, an age in which our ignorance and arrogance, a dangerous combination surely, will lead us, indeed may already have led us, towards catastrophe. The present examples of pestilence, flood, famine, storm, and climatic disruption are surely evidence enough. At the very least, they seem to foretell of conditions of chronic imbalance and disharmony, no doubt as much a part of our inner as our outer condition. In all of this, the practice of modern science more or less ignores the question of what the ultimate goal and purpose of intelligence and knowledge is. Materialist science, it seems, more or less assumes that a continuous and progressive exploratory expansion of knowledge of the physical world will inevitably lead to a desirable end where all but a few of our problems will be solved. I note, however, that it does this in the face of very considerable evidence that science itself provides, that it will not. Indeed, our ignorance in these matters seems to me to be in direct proportion to our obsession with information. More than ever before, we have information from everywhere and about everything, and it is available to us literally at the press of a button. But information, often it would seem for its own sake, is not knowledge, and knowledge is not wisdom. We have no lack of information, but with the loss of the values and principles of which tradition speaks, we lose touch with that perennial wisdom to which this conference is dedicated. And in this I am reminded of those prophetic lines from T.S. Eliot. Where is the life we have lost in living? Where is the wisdom we have lost in knowledge? Where is the knowledge we have lost in information? The cycles of heaven in 20 centuries bring us farther from God and nearer to the dust. So the traditionalist perspective is that we are living at the end of an historical cycle. At the beginning of this cycle, all and every possibility is latent. However, as the cycle evolves or unfolds, these possibilities begin to manifest themselves in the world of time and space, beginning with the highest and gradually moving towards the lower. At the end of the cycle, the very lowest possibilities manifest themselves. The traditionalists tell us that at the cosmic level, this process cannot be withheld or interrupted. It must take place. The cycle, they say, must exhaust itself before a new one can replace it. Now, I know that this might seem to suggest that we are entirely the passive victims of this cosmic unfolding. However, as I understand it, the traditionalists would go on to say that if this were the only reality, then all attempts to pursue and align ourselves with spiritual realities and experience would be in vain. And that cannot possibly be. Indeed, it is precisely on the individual plane and through our understanding of and attachment to traditional norms of metaphysical doctrine and spiritual practice that we can, in a measure, transcend the baleful influence of the descent that is the eventual exhaustion and end of our cycle of history, and prepare ourselves and the world for the beginning of the next. It is in this way, and perhaps only in this way, that we can overcome the mind-numbing despair of modernism, not by false optimism, but by an understanding of and an attachment to the truly real. So I hope that some part of your deliberations at this conference will address these issues and perhaps provide guidance for those of us who do not claim to be scholars. For much of my life has been and remains devoted to finding practical solutions to what at first seem to be impossible difficulties, and sometimes to speak for those whose voices are unheard amidst the clamour of modernism. In this, I recognize that true action is dependent upon constant reflection, the redeeming aspect of the nature of harmony and balance. So, ladies and gentlemen, I pray that your deliberations will help in this task through not only describing the difficulties that we face, but also showing us the ways in which we might seek to make the necessary changes in our lives. Despite not being able to join you in Edmonton, I much look forward to reading the texts of the conference that will be delivered. I hope that you will also find inspiration from them and that they will be widely distributed and discussed, especially beyond those who already subscribe to the teachings of the traditionalists. Whatever our view and whatever our tradition, I am sure that we will have much to learn from your deliberations, and I can only wish you a most harmonious conference. Philip Sherrod was a remarkable man, and although I did not have the pleasure of meeting him during his lifetime, I have been much inspired by his writings, especially all that he has had to say on the subject of the sacred in life and art. I was therefore delighted to hear that the Temenos Academy, of which I have the great pleasure of being patron, was establishing a Sherrod lecture with the generous support of Eileen Guggenheim, who is one of the trustees of my Prince's Foundation in Shoreditch. I was especially pleased to find that the first of these lectures was to be given by Bishop Callistos Ware, who not only knew Philip Sherrod well, and indeed worked with him, but who also speaks with such authority on the great traditions of Christian orthodoxy. I attended the lecture and was, of course, utterly fascinated by all that the bishop had to say. The interview that follows is based upon this lecture and is a record of Bishop Kallistos Ware's thoughts on those parts of Philip Sherrod's life with which he was most concerned.
For part of one afternoon, the ruler of Abu Dhabi arranges a private visit for him to the edge of the empty quarter, the real desert.
You've come out of hectically rushing around the new urban Gulf, and you have a moment here in the virtual silence of the empty quarter.
It is rather remarkable, I must say. You don't often come across such total silence. I mean, such silence, you can actually hear the camera running, which you very rarely do. But, no, I mean, the whole problem, I always find, is you, on these sorts of exercises, these trips, you've suddenly flown and bumped out to somewhere like this for literally half an hour, and then you turn around and go back again. It's not quite the same thing as being able to come for a little bit longer and absorb the atmosphere. But the shadows are so absolutely wonderful. Of course, this time of the day it's better because you get, with the lower sun, you get better shadows.
There are no rulers in tents, but one of the surviving Bedu families is conveniently at hand.
And if you can dip it in the, or if not, stuff it.
I never tried garlic.
If you don't really smell it, you just drink it hot. That's the best way. This is just now, they milk it just now. So it's fresh.
Camel's milk, he is told, is famous as an aphrodisiac.
For the job.
Fat lot of use is going to be to me. I thought it was rhino horn that was visiting.
Rhino horn?
It's amazing because the bustard is so big, isn't it?
Yes.
I used to do this when I was young. Scotland.
I see.
We do again with grouse.
I'll explain it to them.
Yeah. Tell them I used to spend a long time in the early mornings. The most important thing is to try to find ways of understanding each other. I think that the difficulty is the extremists always hold the high ground in these areas if you're not careful. It's so easy to encourage negative forces to be unleashed, I think. I just worry about the future from the point of view of people looking for potential threats, potential enemies.
The royal party arrives in Saudi Arabia late at night on the first leg of a 4-day, 4-country slog. But the prince likes Arabia and is enthralled by the culture of Islam.
I think we've tended to look at the East as being rather primitive and underdeveloped and everything else. And I feel that the time has come to remind people in the West, if they can be reminded, of the important things that we can still learn from the East and from Islam.
King Fahd, the most powerful man in the Gulf, has been so taken by the Oxford speech that he accords the prince an unprecedented honor. At 3 o'clock in the morning, the king leaves his palace to welcome the prince at his guest house.
Because he, his father and grandfather...
After the small talk, the king and the prince discussed Islam at length, in an atmosphere so cordial that the Foreign Office was delighted.
It's been a great asset to the life in London, I can assure you.
The royal yacht is in the Gulf showing the British flag, a flag which the prince believes could be flown to much greater effect.
I've tried in the past to bring all the different parties together, from the Foreign Office, the British Overseas Trade Board, the Department of Trade and Industry and all these sort of characters to work out how we can make a particularly British impact in any country that I visit, because it seems to me it's important to build on any atmosphere or whatever one may create and coordinate the whole approach. But it's very difficult to do it.
Why?
Don't ask me. Ask them. But there are amazing things you can use now, aren't there, to eat up the oil in a biological way. Apparently they did this with that Exxon Valdez. Do you remember the spill in Alaska?
We're a bit worried about that because it is possible that you introduce some sort of a bacteria that is not commensurate with the environment.
The environment is exactly.
So we're trying to grow our own bacteria and introduce it.
To do that. Now I heard of environment. No, I heard of a British company recently. They sent me who produced these mattresses made of straw.
Now
which apparently works brilliantly, and you put it on the sea and it soaks it up.
It doesn't have any side effects.
Apparently not. That's wonderful. The only trouble is you've got to get rid of the straw mattress. So they can't do so much.
Think how much service you have done to them.
I am glad.
Saving the architecture.
I don't know, but just reminding people that there's another
That's a great reminder.
way of looking at things. I tell you, I was such a great admirer of Hassan Fatih.
I'm one of his...
Were you one of his students?
Yes.
No, but see, the man also I think is wonderful is another of his students called Abdul Wahid al-Wakil,
yes.
who I hope will be... I want him to design the Oxford Islamic Centre. He's very elusive.
I saw him in Samarkand
you did?
about 10 days ago. So I'm running around like a...
Between architecture and business, we have perfumery. He's the biggest perfume manufacturer in the city.
Really?
And he's going to donate some to you, so you're going to
Really?
very nice.
Oh, wonderful. But I rather like that, you call it oil of oud, which is marvellous stuff. You know everything. I know a little bit. And what about, do you get back to the UK occasionally or no?
Yeah, I have to go back for summer.
Came over summer. Did you get any money for your teeth when they came out?
No,
Did you? I wish I could remember.
Throughout the Gulf, the prince has been told that his respect for Islam is not reflected in Western attitudes towards Bosnia.
As you know, I mean, they watch the television, so many people now, and they see all these horrors going on in Bosnia. And this is the other thing that came through to me very much, was the extent to which they feel, wrongly I think, that what is happening there with the Muslim ethnic groups in Bosnia is an attempt by European Christianity to drive the Muslims out of Europe. And I don't know how you get through on that question. And all these sort of things seem to build up to a head of steam, don't they?
Does that mean that spiritually and intellectually you find yourself at home, walking between and within all those religions and don't feel tied to the Church of England, the Protestant Church?
Yes, I mean, I feel that there's an enormous amount, once you begin to understand where we are linked in common, that can be immensely helpful. And I'm one of those people who searches. I'm interested in pursuing a path, if I can find it, through the thickets.
But when the prince inherits the crown, he also inherits a symbolic role at the pinnacle of the established church, a role that his approach calls into question. At the coronation, Prince Charles watched his mother enthroned as the supreme governor of the Church of England, defender of the faith. The coronation placed in the Queen a sacred duty to protect the established Church of England over all others.
God crown you with a crown of glory and righteousness, that having a right faith and manifold fruit of good works, you may obtain the crown of an everlasting kingdom by the gift of him whose kingdom endureth forever. Amen.
The title was given to King Henry VIII over 400 years ago, who had happened at that particular time to please the Pope quite enormously. So he was given this title, whereupon shortly after he decided that for some reason or other, it was because he wanted to get divorced, that things were rather different. The Pope was a damn nuisance because he wouldn't grant him the divorce, which again is one of the reasons why the Church of England developed, which I think is necessary to remember. And so the title then remained, rather because I suspect King Henry VIII liked it. And, well, I personally, you see, would much rather see it as defender of faith, not the faith, because it means just one particular interpretation of the faith, which I think is sometimes something that causes a great deal of problem. It has done for hundreds of years. People have fought each other to the death over these things. It seems to me a peculiar waste of people's energy when we're all actually aiming for the same ultimate goal, I think. So I mean, I would much rather it was seen as defending faith itself, which is so often under so much threat in our day, where, you know, the whole concept of faith or belief in anything beyond this existence, beyond life itself, is considered almost old-fashioned and irrelevant.
So a defender of faith means defender of those who believe in a God in whatever form that you would want to encourage that, that capacity and that urge.
Yes, I mean, defender of the divine in existence. The pattern of the divine, which is, I think, in all of us, but which is, because we are human beings, can be expressed in so many different ways. I've always felt the Catholic subjects of the sovereign are equally as important as the Anglican ones or the Protestant ones. Likewise, I think that the Islamic subjects or the Hindu subjects or the Zoroastrian subjects of the sovereign are of equal and vital importance.
There is always some culture at hand, but in circumstances that almost make a hell out of what might have been heaven. His hosts have promised that their guest can have a moment to himself inside a Baroque masterpiece. Unfortunately, half Mexico wants to share his privacy.
It's a great pleasure to have you here. You are now in one of the churches that represent our Mexican Baroque.
Yes.
This was formerly occupied by the Jesuits, by a novitiate of the Jesuits,
Was there anybody in charge of this event?
Yes, there was the governor. The point is, what he's completely hijacked it by getting so many people in. It's ruined it.
His own gratification.
And the rest of the saints, of course, they remain us, the family of Jesus that are around these saints.
We've got to be wheels rolling in 8 minutes. See what you can do.
Pull the arm off.
For the prince, a royal visit involves a trade-off between what his hosts want and what he wants. They want him on show. He wants to see the other Mexico, the one that really agitates him. In 1992, the prince opened his own Institute of Architecture, putting his and other people's money where his mouth had long been.
Pull it back into...
Here, students learn the traditional skills, craftsmanship as well as design, the importance of harmony and precision, the vitality of the vernacular.
You don't need massive depth to get shadow. If you look at the model here...
The Institute is based on what the prince refers to as timeless principles, the spiritual harmony of classical form, the importance of pure observation.
I know that, you know, the great sort of charge that gets leveled against me, you know, is that I've spoilt so many people's, you know, careers and jobs. I mean, it's not true. I never mentioned any of them at all. I just wanted to make the point that I felt, anyway, that you know, we needed to re-examine these issues, and I didn't particularly want to see this country, which I mind about and love greatly, and nor do a lot of other people, disappear under a welter of ugliness. And again, I just want to say one more thing to emphasize, you know, the real basis on which I've tried to express these feelings about architecture, and that is that while I am thoroughly in favor of an avant-garde, generally, what I do not think is sensible in the long run and right is when the avant-garde becomes the establishment. And that is what has happened, I believe, not only in architectural terms, but in many other areas as well.
Whenever he can, wherever he is, the prince likes to paint. His watercolors, like his personal protection officers, are therefore always with him. On this occasion, he's in Wales, commissioned by the Royal Mail to paint some castles for a set of stamps to celebrate the investiture.
It's got nice shadows on this side. It's sort of a nice shape, I think. At least the sun is roughly in the right place. It'll just be annoying because this evening it'll be wonderful. Probably the light will be just right when I'm sitting in the concert at Monmouth. It is one way of, apart from, you know, the enjoyment of it, it's one way of making a little money for my charities trust, and that's, in fact, I actually make quite a lot, fun enough.
In fact, his watercolors now have some cachet, enough to raise over £1 million for his charities.
If I had a bit more time, I might, I think, perhaps be a bit more bold, if you know what I mean. I'm not very adventurous when it comes to painting at the moment. But I come to the conclusion that, I mean, with art, and so you've got to learn how to do the basics, and you've got to learn how to actually paint what's there before you can start thinking about painting what may be in your imagination, I think, I would have thought. It's a good discipline, if nothing else. But the trouble is I stopped at school, you see. Did carpentry instead, and then pottery like an idiot. And then I don't know what it was. I think I was desperate to try and find some other way of capturing the landscape of things that I liked, and with a camera. I never found it satisfactory. You take a photograph, but to me it didn't have the same feel. But I felt it here, and wanted to express it on paper. But it's terribly difficult because you see it, and then you look at other people's wonderful watercolours like Turner or Copman and all these modern people. And you lot, I mean, a lot of people get like that, but of course you can't. But I have got a bit better in the last 25, 30 years, I think, but I've been doing it. A bit, anyway, I think.
When Prince Charles paints, he says that he enters another dimension. His passion for nature, his sense of belonging to the natural world, is an integral part of his spiritual identity. He believes in a divine order, but his faith is not conventional. In his search for God, he's explored other beliefs and has found in them the essential truths of his own religion.
All the great prophets, all the great thinkers, those who had achieved a far greater awareness of the aspects of life which lie beneath the surface, all shared the same understanding of the universe, or the nature of God, or the purpose of our existence. And that's why I feel that it's so important to understand the common threads which link us all in one, I think, great and important tapestry.
Not only did they wreck the London skyline in general, they also did their best to lose the Great Dome in a jostling scrum of office buildings, so mediocre that the only way you ever remember them is by the frustration they induce, like a basketball team standing shoulder to shoulder between you and the Mona Lisa. You have, ladies and gentlemen, to give this much to the Luftwaffe. When it knocked down our buildings, it didn't replace them with anything more offensive than rubble. We did that.
Committed to a vision of what Great Britain was and should be. It's all laid out in bricks and mortar in Poundbury, a village of 2,500 people which he created on his land near Dorchester in the south of England. All of his ideas on architectural design, class structure, aesthetics, and ecology are here. And what he sees as the future looks very much like the past, an 18th century village adapted for the 21st.
And that's a convenience store, which I'm very proud of, which everybody said wouldn't work. That's the pub, which, again, nobody wanted to touch. But now, of course, the values are going up and up and up.
Yeah, I've been looking around for any signs of the modern and the flimsy. I don't see it. The place is built to last.
Well, that's what I've been trying to encourage people to think about, to break the conventional mold in the way we've been building and designing for the last, well, during the last century, really, has all been part of a throwaway society.
Everything here is constructed of native or recycled materials. Sustainable development, he calls it, that conserves the Earth's resources. Single-family homes are mixed with small apartments so that there are people of all income levels here living side by side in a community with shops and light industry. The narrow, twisty roads discourage automobile traffic, and cars are parked out of sight in landscaped lots.
The whole of the 20th century has always put the car at the center. So by putting the pedestrian first, you create these livable places, I think, with more attraction and interest and character and livability.